day, everyone. Thank you very much, Program Director. Thank you, MC, for the generous introduction. Any introduction that makes me look nice, that makes you sound like a good person, at least. I was always considered so privileged to get and humbling. So thank you so much. Serious thank you and shout out to the SAGSA committee for the invitation. Thank you very much. It is a joy to be here with all of you and to share, albeit virtually, a few thoughts from my space and time. And most importantly, I think I'd like to thank also the many children who we learn from. I'd like to thank the colleagues, many of you listening to this talk, but also fellow teachers who at this moment face the same complexity that we all do of trying to figure out what life looks like in the 21st century and in the 21st century classroom in this part of the world. So really it is with great humility that I run through the next half an hour of your time. And I've got a stopwatch, so I'm watching it, and I will be watching my time as I share with you. I will be sharing with you something that I think is a little more research than it is opinion, but it is more reflection than it is a paper. It is more meditation than it is a talk, and perhaps it is more of a sermon than it is maybe a TED talk. So those are some of the disclaimers that I think are important to bring into the room. And I say those because I am somebody who loves to think about social justice as who now teaches it, but also who has worked to think about what those strategies that we can employ to realize a more loving and just society in the world. And to me, social justice is exactly that, love in public. And so it is a joy to share with you. There are many hats I wear, and whilst I have read and thought and try my best to really share some ideas that I've come across and things that I found interesting in the short time that we're going to have together, I can only point to the conversations that I would think are important for us to be having at this time, point to the actions that I think we ought to be practicing, point to the direction that I believe together we must move in. And most importantly, I think in thinking through the next half hour and some of the reflections for myself, what I hold most important is the accessibility and of the work. And so I am a man of faith and spirituality, and whilst I belong to the Christian tradition, which you will come across, it is often my reflection, my prayer, my desire that my faith and spirituality, whilst enriching and life-giving in so many ways to myself, always be a bridge to people. And even though it influences my work, and of that I am profoundly grateful, but that I hope that its use will not make the work inaccessible, but that it will be framed in ways that can be a bridge. We need bridges now. And so many hats that I think are so important to share. And so there are many things that I'd like us to think about, and in my presentation, which is very wordy, I apologize. Like I said, there are components that I would prefer to give in a short meditation or a reflection. There are components that I think are just basic kind of research ideas and concepts that I'd like us to look at, and I think that there are other moments where that I think it is good to think without visual stimulation. So I apologize by death by PowerPoint. I understand, and I do hope that that it is not too onerous, but that the sharing, particularly for the quotes, some of the quotes from the books, can be a little bit dense, but are, I believe, important and are pointing us to particular ideas. Right. Perhaps, like all good things, let's begin with a story. I grew up in the KZN, the Midlands of KZN, in a small town called Escort. And in this small town, the township is 12 kilometers outside of the town where I grew up. And one day, my family was gathered at my grandmother's home, and there was a big conversation and issue. And at that time, one of the things that was very serious and happening within our particular context was that we were at the end of what really was a civil war between the ANC and the IFP in KZN at that time, but also now the sharp increase in HIV, AIDS cases and deaths. And in the complexity of the discussion that we were having as a family at the time, a question was raised which has stayed with me for many years since then. And the question, in this impasse that the family was at, the question in this moment in having to determine a way forward was, what does love do now? What is love inviting us to do now? And that is one of the questions I'd like us to hold into the room and into the space. I'd like us to hold that question in the ways in which it is inviting us to pause and to reflect, in the ways that it is inviting us to act and to fall in the ways in which it is asking us to stand alongside and by each other. What does love do now? Working in the space of transformation or diversity or belonging, so many words, inclusion, there's so many words that we have, so many concepts. What does love do now? What are the things that we need to be thinking about in terms of the configuration of our campuses, the experiences on our campuses? How do we pin down the state of things and know what to do? All right, we begin. The state of things: school timetables, COVID-19, teachers, COVID compliance, depression, chairs of council on the phones for school leadership, which I'm pretty sure many of you will appreciate, board members, family and friend bereavements, living in a pandemic, teacher retirements, internships, balancing home life, the 2021 intake, the 2020 intake, the socialization of our children through the schooling system, new building projects that had started and had not started and needed to be paused because of COVID. All sorts of complexities fill the life of a leader of a school at whatever level. And perhaps closer to headship you get, the more complexities one has to deal with. And so I'd like to acknowledge the state of things and what we're dealing with. That whilst we think about wellness and belonging and the concept of goodness on our campus, how to heighten wellness, how to think about wellness, what to interrogate about wellness at this time, what are the things that are also happening in the world around us? And so there's this interesting concept I'd like to share, which was brought to my attention in an article in the New York Times by Adam Grant. And Adam Grant, in researching the work of the sociologist Corey Keyes, speaks about the concept of languishing. Now, Corey Keyes defined languishing is defined as the state in which an individual is devoid of positive emotion towards life. It is not a functioning well, either psychologically or socially, and has not been depressed during the past year. In short, languishes are neither mentally ill or mentally healthy. Dr. McGarvey from Johns Hopkins writes, languishing encompasses distressing feelings of stagnation, monotony, and emptiness. So many of us are feeling that at this time. Global literature around psychology speaks about the world being in an endless state of languish. And so I'd like us to think about the concept of languish and put it in conversation with the concept of wellness. What does it mean for us and for our schooling systems to be in this state of languish? What does it mean for us to think about mental health at this time and the way in which it has impacted everything we do and everyone we lead? Adam Grant, trying to unpack this idea, says you do not have symptoms of mental health, but you're not in the picture of mental health. You're not the picture of mental health either. You're not functioning at full capacity. Languishing dulls your motivation, disrupts your ability to focus, and triples the odds that you'll cut back on work. What option is there at school leadership to cut back on work at this time? So many of us are dealing with this pandemic, dealing with various positive cases and so on, all sorts of things. And even as I speak to this, my own sense of anxiety increases. How do we think about wellness and the concept in conversation with the concept of languish? What wellness can there be if our current mental state is not fundamentally of flourishing, but not fundamentally of innate and deep depression? There are brothers and sisters in our sector, in the country, in the world, who face depression in very real ways. And so how do we think about all of this at this time? And so this wellness that we're talking about, which speaks to a dynamic, right, of process, a dynamic process of change and growth. It's a beautiful line I love. How do we think about wellness at this time and the various elements of wellness that we must now negotiate? Intellectual, emotional, financial, physical, environmental, vocational, and social. All of these are at work in our system. All of these are at work in ourselves. And so these are important areas that we're going to need to think about within the context of that we're not just dealing with our campuses being fraught by diversity and issues around race. We're also dealing with our campuses being fraught because of a particular kind of emotional wellness or lack thereof in our student bodies. Spiritual wellness, vocational wellness, physical wellness, at a time where our bodies are navigating and fighting one of the oldest things on the planet, this virus. And so I'd like us to talk about love. It's going to be an important conversation because I believe, as Parker Palmer writes, the goal of a knowledge rising, arising from life, is the reunification and reconstruction of broken selves and worlds. A knowledge of compassion aims not at exploiting and manipulating creation, but at reconciling the world to itself. The mind motivated by compassion reached out to know as the heart reaches out to love. Hence, the act of knowing is an act of love. The act of entering and embracing the reality of the other, of allowing the other to enter and embrace our own. In such, we know and are known as member of one community. And in thinking about what love has to do with it, in thinking about what love is, I think Parker Palmer speaks to something quite important about the intersection between knowledge, understanding, not just being books, not just being theories, but a knowledge of compassion. Palmer writes, love. David Steindl-Rast says, love is a lived yes, a practiced yes to belonging together. And I'd like us to invite and think about love as this invitation. Love as this invitation to various states of being that I'm going to run through now in the next few minutes. What do we do? How do we harness, think through love as a social ethic, love as a political ethic, love as a theological ethic, and an economic ethic to building a better, kinder society, a society that is more well. And some of the questions that I imagine many of you hold is, and that I've navigated and spoken to a number of heads, some of which, thank you, I imagine might be listening to this talk, but who I've worked with and advised and spoken to and partnered up with in thinking about belonging in institutions. Ellen, what do we do about gender in monastic schools? Class and socioeconomic barriers in high fee paying schools? What do you do with the battle lines that are drawn in our schools? Councils, boards, the progressive students, the progressive parents, conservatives, students, staff, parents, staff rooms divided, staff rooms thinking that we're doing too much, we're giving too much airtime to the students, sometimes thinking not, sometimes we should be doing more, sometimes we are not fostering enough collaboration. So what do we think about, how do we think about all these battle lines that fill our campuses? And how do we invite our community to a stillness, a pause, an understanding, and an action that will help resolve the stalemate that we find? Staff wellness, mental health, staff fatigue, online learning, access to online learning. Some do, some do not. And how do we create cultures of collaboration? What does love do now? What is love inviting us to? And so this unloving humanity, and this is, I laughed a little bit at this because I was like, oh, so many big woke words. Heteronormative, imperialist, capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchy. Comes from Bell Hooks, being quoted here. And Laverne Cox says, I'll do you one better. Cisnormative, heteronormative, imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchy. What do all these words mean? And some of us have interacted with these words in the last few years as we begin to think through how we interact and in dialogue and get into progressive conversations with our students. How do we begin to find each other from the various vantage points, political and otherwise, that we are at, realizing that we are full systems. And yet there are all these concepts that we have that now inform and shape our lived experience. Capitalism, patriarchy, heteronormativity. We are whole systems. We are whole people who come from particular vantage points, and yet we must lead communities who must find a way towards a future that is shared. Future of dignity and peace. And so I think it's so important at this time that we truly, truly, truly begin to think about the different ways in which love calls us to many things. I'd like us to reflect on some of the inequality in our country. Stats SA says to us, in 2019, the average white household was earning 24,000 Rand, average black African household, 6,000 Rand. This data speaks, given to us by New Frame, is the data about the top 10%. The top 10% of the population in South Africa in 1993, the top 10% of the South African population in 1993 had 86% of the country's wealth. The bottom 50% was at minus 1%. We had no stats for Russia at that time. China's top 10% of the country's population had 41% of the country's wealth, and the bottom 50% at 16%. American was at 65% of the top 10% in 93. In the year 2000, 84% of the country's wealth was in the hands of the top 10%, minus 2% for the bottom 50%. Of which I imagine people we know are a part. Both groups. 2010, 90% of South Africa's wealth was in the hands of the top 10% of the population, minus 7%. 66 is to 3% for Russia. 63 is to 7% for China. 74 is to 3% for the US. 2015, 87 and 3. And so it goes. And so it seems that we haven't moved much. It seems that we remain in the stalemate. And the reason I'm speaking from this, and there are other vantage points that one could use to speak to this thing and speak to the current context, but I do think that the configuration of our country, in terms of what we see and touch, the material and structural conversation that we need to be having, deeply impacts the way in which we have shared resources in this country. Think about resources. And I'd like us to be conscious of the needs and the responsibilities of government, but that's not where I'm coming from. I'm speaking to people who, in the education space, I would like us to put our minds together as to what our space will do, what our campuses will do, what our children can do, what we can do. And so this endless picture, this picture of the great divisions, and this is a melting pot of realities. The suburb is no longer just a white space. Many suburbs are diverse. The Naidus down the road, the Van Heerdens back opposite, the Kumalos who live up the road, different communities of people, layers and layers and layers and layers of complexity. Lived realities that are at work in both these contexts influence our day and our time. How do we think through class and race within the context of such socialization? These spaces are currently shaping the minds and experiences of young South Africans right now. These spaces are currently shaping our experience of what it means to live in the world, what it means to be safe, what it means to have joy, what it means to have family, what it means to have a space in which one can reasonably, if one has to bring a more relevant example, isolate. Where does one isolate with dignity? There are many complexities. What does love do now? And within ourselves, I'd like us to think about the kinds of conversation. We ourselves speak about our politics as we speak about our wiring, our brain wiring, that even when you know exactly that it's not the right thing to say or do, but we have neural pathways and motorways in our head that have been shaped because we have grown up in a particular way and have been socialized in a particular way. Endless times when I once heard my family got together and was like, we're tired of my dad being the person who always gets cooked for. No one is going to cook. And we'd all agreed our politics was aligned. No one was going to cook. Dad was going to get home and all of us were going to be busy with something and he'd have to cook. And the minute Dad got in, we had a really fat conversation and we all died of laughter. And then Dad was like, oh, what's for dinner? And we were like, oh, actually, maybe we should, and people started chopping. And so sometimes our politics, our intention is one thing, but we've been socialized in a particular way into another thing. And our hearts can be distressed by that. So there are conversations that are at work within each of us about watching yourself speak as your brain defaults to a particular thing and regretting the words as they fall out of your mouth. How do we shape and help our brains catch up with our new reality? Love brings truth. James Cone, theologian, says, if we cannot recognize the truth, then it cannot liberate us from untruth. To know the truth is to prepare for it. For it is not mainly reflection and theory. Truth is divine action entering our lives and creating the human action of liberation. Truth alleviates burdens. It helps. It grows and develops. How do we think through the people who bring truth into our lives? How do we think through the ability of our students on each campus to understand and have a relationship with the truth. What is our relationship with the truth? And how do we navigate the age of truths? If one has to take a postmodern look at it, truth is so complex and so layered. Love and anger, a conversation that needs to be had. Austin Channing Brown writes, "It shouldn't have surprised me. I serve a God who experienced and expressed anger." One of the most meaningful passages of scripture is found in the New Testament, where Jesus leads a one-man protest inside the temple walls. Jesus shouts, that should be shout, at corrupt temple officials, overturns furniture, sets animals free, blocks the doorways with his body, and carries a whip through the place. Jesus throws out folk at the building, and in doing so creates space for the most marginalized to come in, the poor, the wounded, the children. I imagine the next day's newspapers, writes Brown, called Jesus' anger destructive. But I think that those without power would have said that his anger led to freedom. The freedom of belonging, the freedom of healing, and the freedom of participating as full members in God's house. In what ways do we engage the anger? Do we sit with the anger? Do we negotiate our fear of the anger? So that it points us to love. Love helps us be still. Stillness is important. And one of the things I'd like us to reflect on is the words of Kevin Kwashi in a book called The Sovereignty of Quiet. Another idiom for thinking about quiet expressiveness is prayer. Conceptually, prayer is an expression of one's contemplation and dreaming. And yet this expressiveness cannot be articulated completely or precisely. It is figurative and poetic. In this sense, prayer is a type of exceptional communication, much richer than speech alone. It is a particular kind of speech that acts, and a particular kind of action that speaks to the depths and height of being. The language of prayer is fashioned from a deep level of human understanding that exists beneath or beyond what is conscious. And the very magic of prayer, its will and ability to make something happen, is constant with ineffability. In this way, prayer reflects the most perfect communication, to speak to one who is and is not oneself. This excellent communication exposes the praying self as both needy and capable. Now, not all schools are Christian schools, not all schools are religious schools, not all schools even have a spiritual component to them. Spirituality is important. Maybe not religion, but spirituality is important. That's an important part of human health. So finding ways of stillness and quiet, to me, is very crucial to engaging the mental illness of the moment, the stress of the moment, the difficulties, the contested relationships, the stalemates, the pain, the suffering, the silence, the fear, the anxiety, the anger, all of those things. We need to find ways of bringing stillness and quiet to our campuses. I was doing a workshop a couple of years ago at our sister school in St. Mary's, Waverley. I'm allowed to talk about St. Mary's. I'm at St. John's. They are our sister school, so I can pant them. Hey, Deanne. Anyway, at one moment, the Angelus bell rings, midday, for the Angelus prayer. An old Roman Catholic tradition, an Anglo-Catholic tradition, pause in the day to say the Hail Mary and to venerate life and thank God for goodness and peace and the gift that we have. But one thing that I found quite profound was that when that was happening, it was the students that stilled me. And when they stilled me, they said, "Sir," and the room fell silent, and the campus fell silent. I practiced on a campus that taught me a profound lesson in stillness. Some students might have prayed, some didn't, but all of us shared in a moment of quiet. How do we do that? Mindfulness, meditation, whatever the strategy is, how do we bring and enter that energy as a way of helping us access each other and hold complexity and difficulty? What does it mean for the road ahead? 3 things I'd like us to talk about as I wrap up. Cultures of learning, cultures of service, and practices of fairness. 3 main things that I think are very important for us to be thinking about at this time. Love and learning. Bell Hooks says to us, love in the classroom prepares teachers and students to open our hearts and our minds. Towards the end, she says, love will always move away from domination in all its forms. Favoritism is not going to be a thing. Love is always challenge and change. It will always challenge and change us. And so in learning, I'd like us to think about the cultures, the staff cultures that are at work. I'd like us to think about staff development. I'd like us to think about student workshops. I'd like us to think about parent engagements. Each member of our community, stakeholder group in our community, must now learn. Teachers as students, parents as students. All of us must buckle down. We must read. Reading is important. Reading is important. My English teachers, all my teachers were right, actually. I should just write them a thank you later. Anyway, those cultures of learning are going to be important in trying to build bridges. Love as learning. Love as an invitation to learning. And part of what lies in learning is epistemic humility, the willingness to learn. Each of our students, for all of us who stood in a classroom, all of those students take upon epistemic humility the minute they sit down. Episteme, knowledge, humility. Says that which I know is not all there is. No, that which I know can grow. Epistemic humility is an important part of learning. It's going to be an important part of the adult experience in the 21st century. How do we keep learning? And how does love invite us to do that? Cultures of service. I spoke quite a bit about the inequality in this country because I believe there lies a particular kind of area that our schools need to think about and rigorously reflect on, particularly in relation to their own contribution to that space. There's a profound amount of suffering in this country. Martin Luther King writes, in a real sense, all life is interrelated. The agony of the poor impoverishes the rich. The betterment of the poor enriches the rich. We are inevitably our brothers, sisters, siblings' keeper. Because we are our brother's brother, our sister's sister, our sibling's sibling. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. How do we think through community now? And community, not just ourselves, community is in our society. How do we think through the needs of community? What are the things that we must do? How do we build cultures of service? How do we not do charity work? Not charity. No one is saving anyone. And I think charity has its place in society, and I'm not saying that that's bad. But I do think that community engagement, social responsibility within the educational context must take a particular kind of configuration to ensure that students remain grounded, that students understand that there is profound amounts of learning that they can do in those particular activities, but in that they're being gifted with something profound. In feeding the hungry and washing the feet of their brothers and sisters in the world, they get to see the realities outside the bubbles that we've created. And it is impossible to create a bubble of wellness, right? Our campuses can't be well whilst living in a society fraught with pain and suffering. Our own internal sense cannot be fully well whilst our staff rooms and our classrooms and our campuses are filled with that level of suffering, with contestation, with pain and with suffering. We must address it together. And so community engagement helps us step out into society and look at the material and structural lived reality of people in our country and allow our hearts to be broken. Because part of the socialization of this country, that at every traffic light, at every intersection that we pass in our cars, we teach ourselves and often the children in our cars how to ignore profound suffering. And I'm guilty and complicit in this. What does that mean? When even as we approach, we learn to say no. I have nothing for you today. And sometimes there's food, sometimes there's excess, sometimes we've bought bread, sometimes we've tried. But by and large, we are being socialized and are continuing to grow into a country that in some ways, all of us learn to interact with profound suffering and poverty as a day-to-day experience. What happens when our children become used to that, used to saying no? What happens when people who are begging us for bread are being framed as annoyances and criminals? What happened here? Cultures of service are about material and structural changes to the very lived and created conditions in this country. And government has a role to play, yes, but it's not about government right now. It's about how we as schools think together to save our children. For to not do this, to not teach children about the lived realities of our country and about their ability as human beings to do something about it, in some ways is to set them up for war. It's to set them up to fight one day. We must help them solve the mess that they didn't create. James Baldwin says, love takes off our masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. Love here, not merely in the personal sense, we're not talking about sentimentality or romance, but as a state of being or a state of grace, not in the infantile, worldly sense, being made happy, but in the tough, universal sense of quest and daring and growth. Love is a verb, and I believe it invites us to learning, it invites us to service, but it also invites us to practicing fairness. How do we figure out practices of fairness for our campuses? Which is the last thing I'd like to talk about, and I think we need to think about those within the context of so many of the policies that are the scaffolding of our space, our admissions and our targets, our employment equity, the configuration of our staff room, and the importance of a representative staff room to be able to bring an idiom into the room, not just about representation to the students, right? Diverse staff rooms are great for representation, yes, but that's not the only thing. There's another idiom, a knowledge base that comes into the staff room, a wisdom that we need about the contestation. We need to share experiences and learning, but not for the purposes of doing it, but with a very real committed way of practicing belonging together on our campuses. Restorative justice, the last point, is a key element of this. Restorative justice is key. How do we begin to find ways of restoring relationships rather than retributive systems? Many disciplinary codes don't even have the victim in the room. And what does that teach children about what they need to deal with in the practical society that they live in this country? Where whether it is the black people who are going to be the victim in the room, from a history of historical racial oppression, the women, gender-based violence. How do we think through the violence that people in the LGBTIQ plus community, or the political term which I use with thought, the queer community in our space, children who navigate so many of those complexities and who feel and experience profound amounts of violence, bullying, and so on, rather than somebody saying, I will sit with you. I will sit with you. We will figure it out. Restorative justice is key and important. And as a part of the disciplinary system, I think it needs consideration. It helps us make amends. It asks the question, what will make it better? And our junior school and primary school heads and I think and deputies will know that this is quite a big thing that's already happening in private schools, in primary schools and junior schools, because I remember in my own time, and that was the early 1990s in former Model C schools then, in my school in KZN, I remember countless times, and I've seen it with colleagues more recently, where a teacher would facilitate a restorative justice moment. What happened? How did it make you feel? What were you thinking when you did it? What will make it better? Apologize. Are you okay? Are you okay? Okay. Let's hug it out. Now, you guys, go. Restorative justice is a practice that is not alien to us. But I think we need to bring it up into peer education with senior students as well. Love is the way. Love is the way. And The Sovereignty of Quiet, a profound book that I recommend that you read. Brilliant. The Sovereignty of Quiet. Love is an ethic, a responsibility to and of the self. And in its self-centeredness, it is not apolitical, but neither is it driven by the terms set by political and social discourse. There is no responsibility greater than this self-righteousness, this pursuit of right that is motivated by knowing that one does not know, that one is frail and is subject to harm or being wrong. Humility. This pursuit that is animated by terror and the beauty of life. Love demands a descent into the interior. It leaves us filled with vulnerability and ambition and rage that rivals anything the social world can produce. It fosters connection without foregoing the particularity of the inner life. Love is the practice and the prize. How do we find a way? So much complexity, all at work. Navigating gender as monastic schools will be key, and all the more complex. Race, religion, disability, culture, sexual orientation, and so on. Arundhati Roy says the pandemic is a portal. Historically, pandemics have forced human beings to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, the gateway between one world and the next. One can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our databanks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little baggage, ready to imagine the world anew. Imagine another world and be ready to fight for it. We must pause. We must reflect. Love can help and heal when nothing else can. It builds bridges. It can burn with anger. It can break us down and do so for our own good. That it can help us catch each other. We must learn together. We must serve together. And we must practice fairness together. Love is the way. Thank you so much for this time. I'm so sorry for going over time. I hope we think and we reflect. I hope we work together. Sit still together. Be quiet together. I hope we share and learn together. I hope we build this country together. Thank you very much.